While the world of horror is filled with classics such as Friday the 13th and the Halloween franchise, Texas Chainsaw Massacre has managed to establish quite a fan base of its own. Given its popularity, several remakes, spin-offs, and comic series have been released since the original movie hit the theaters in 1974. The 2003 Texas Chainsaw Massacre film was one of these releases, which sought inspiration from the original and was also loosely inspired by the crimes of serial killer Ed Gein. To add to this, the movie's release was followed by the launch of a comic series that served as a prequel to the events of the film. And today, we will explore both the movie and the comics in great detail. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Exploring the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 2003. Kicking off with some archival footage from a police investigation at the Hewitt house. We see several grotesque things lying around the basement, from fingernail scratches carved into the walls to human blood and hair lying all around. The house looks ghastly as the scene shifts to August 1973, where a group of 5 friends make their way to a concert. Introduced as Erin, Kemper, Morgan, Andy, and Pepper, these friends pass by Texas and stumble upon a hitchhiker who asks for their help and eventually shoots herself after warning them about an evil man. Distraught and shaken up by what they had just witnessed, the group immediately rushes to contact the police and comes across a woman who tells them that they will find the sheriff at the mill. As they arrive at the mill, a young boy named Jedediah reveals that the sheriff is actually drinking away at home, and Morgan, Andy, and Pepper stay with him at the mill while Erin and Kemper set out on a journey to find the sheriff's house. They make their way through the forest and finally come across a plantation house, where an amputee named Monty lets Erin in and allows her to make a phone call before Kemper heads in. In an unfortunate turn of events, Leatherface, aka Thomas Hewitt, strikes Kemper down with an axe and immediately kills him. He then proceeds to carve a mask out of his face in typical Leatherface fashion when a box falls out of Kemper's pocket and reveals that he was about to propose to Erin with a ring. On the other hand, Sheriff Hoyt finally reaches the mill and learns about the hitchhiker's death, proceeding to wrap her up in cellophane and take her body with him. He also advises the 3 young kids to leave the place while Erin also returns and realizes that Kemper has gone missing. Andy comes along with Erin to Monty's house to look for him. While Monty realizes what Leatherface has done this time around, he then calls him out to attack Andy, and Leatherface soon appears with his chainsaw and cuts his leg off while Erin makes a speedy escape. While Erin returns to the mill, Leatherface carries Andy to the basement and hangs him with the help of a meat hook before wrapping his leg in butcher paper and using human hair to secure it in place. As the scene shifts to Erin, she gets in the van with Morgan and Pepper and tries to make a quick escape, but Sheriff Hoyt finds some marijuana in the van and orders them all to step aside. He then hands a gun to Morgan and tells him to show him how the hitchhiker killed herself, but Morgan panics and aims the gun at Hoyt. He naturally does not take kindly to this, and he then handcuffs Morgan and takes him to the Hewitt house's basement, while Erin and Pepper are left behind to fend for themselves. Unfortunately for them, the 2 girls end up crossing paths with Leatherface, who had gone ahead and used Kemper's face as a mask, while Pepper falls victim to Leatherface's schemes, who cut her in half with his chainsaw. Erin once again manages to escape and finds solace in an old lady's house. However, things take a morbid turn for her, and the old lady offers her some drugged tea, while a younger woman, Henrietta, seems to be hiding something. They even tell Erin that they don't have a phone for her to call for help, when a phone rings in a different corner of the house. Soon enough, Henrietta rushes to pick up the phone and tell the other person on the line that she's here, and Erin tries to run away, but soon passes out after sipping on the drugged tea. While she regains consciousness, Erin finds herself at the Hewitt house, where she finally faces Leatherface, as well as his mother, Sheriff Hoyt, Monty, and Jedediah. His mother, Luda May, tries to make a case for him, and even tells Erin that Leatherface, or Thomas Hewitt, was bullied by teenagers when he was young. Soon enough, they take Erin to the basement, where she comes across Andy, who seems to be in pain after losing a leg, but is still somehow alive. She tries to rescue him and take him off the meat hook, but realizes that he will fall directly on the piano and end up making a commotion. Instead of coming up with a plan to save himself, Andy begs her to kill him and put an end to his suffering, while she also comes across Morgan. Finally, Jedediah comes to their rescue and helps them leave the house by stirring up a commotion to keep Leatherface occupied. In the meantime, Erin and Morgan find a moment of peace at an abandoned house in the woods and try to barricade the entrance to keep Leatherface at bay. However, the crazed villain finds a way to break into the house, and Morgan immediately lunges at him and catches him off guard. They briefly fight each other before Leatherface finally overpowers him and kills him with the chainsaw. Once again, Erin realizes she is all alone as she runs away from Leatherface and hides in a factory locker. In typical fashion, Leatherface ends up locating her, but she acts quickly and attacks him with a meat cleaver. This attack ends with Leatherface losing an arm, while Erin runs out of the factory and convinces a passerby trucker to take her along. While she does her best to get away from the Hewitt's house, the trucker ends up at an eatery, where he comes across Luda May and Sheriff Hoyt. Erin continues to observe the scene from afar when she spots Henrietta with a baby and realizes that the baby belongs to the dead hitchhiker who had asked them for help ages ago. She comes up with a plan to save the baby, and in an act of great bravery, she gets in the car and runs it over the sheriff until he dies. She successfully manages to escape from all the madness that the town has to offer, and Leatherface tries to stop her on the road, but to no avail. As the movie ends, a bunch of officials inspect the Hewitt house, and two of them even fall victim to Leatherface's attacks. The credits soon start rolling, as a narrator tells us that this case has not been closed even today, and the only evidence of crime that they have is an image of Thomas Hewitt or Leatherface. A new chapter in a familiar world, the grind, in the 2003 Texas Chainsaw Massacre. All the events in the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, as well as the 2003 remake, seem to be inspired by the Wisconsin serial killer, Ed Gein, who was notoriously known for skinning his victims and carving furniture out of them. However, he did not use a chainsaw or even work with other people, and he mostly targeted people who had already died. In this regard, he only murdered 2 people on his own, but the 1974 movie made use of his name for promotion purposes, especially since they lived in an era of serial killers back in the 70s. In the modern age, the 2003 remake garnered quite a bit of attention, and Avatar Press finally published a 3-part comic series that served as a prequel to the film. The first issue of the comic kicks off with an introduction to a young, unnamed singer who finds herself in the middle of a great tragedy. As the comic picks up pace, we learn that this singer was accompanied by 5 peers, and they embarked on a mission of mercy when things took a turn for the worse and shaped up to be their worst nightmares. Admittedly, the comic starts on a vague note as it attempts to create an atmosphere of dread and horror before finally introducing us to this clan of young singers, aka the Jefferson Girls Choir. While Mr. and Mrs. Millsap drive them to their destination, the young girls, including Julianne, Marcia, Rosa, Louise, and Sadie, gossip with each other and find out that Julianne is writing a letter to her dad. Unfortunately, their bus crashes along the way, and Mr. Millsap rushes to find some help while the girls continue to discuss Julianne's letter. As the scene shifts to Mr. Millsap, we see him enter an abandoned building filled with skeletons and an unbearable stench. When Leatherface appears from the shadows and attacks him, the day soon turns into night, and Mrs. Millsap finally leaves her daughter Ellie with the girls while she looks for her husband. In a plot line inspired by the movie, a local sheriff finds himself on the same path as the young girls, and he inquires about their situation before searching their bus and finding some abandoned marijuana. He soon interrogates them, and the girls end up blaming Julianne, who protests against these allegations. Soon enough, the sheriff loses his cool and remarks on how he can see past their God-fearing choir girl ruse before making them all get into his police car. As the scene shifts to the abandoned building, Mrs. Millsap ends up at the same spot as her husband and soon finds his dead body. However, she does not have a whole lot of time to mourn, as Leatherface strikes her down and ensures that she shares her husband's fate. Meanwhile, the sheriff also takes the girls to the same building and traps all of them except one in one of the rooms. He singles out Mrs. Millsap's daughter, Ellie, and asks her if she wants some ice cream before taking her to meet Leatherface. While the young girl cowers and cries in fear, the rest of the choir demands to be set free, and the sheriff has no option but to return to the room to silence them. Leatherface also follows suit, and these girls find themselves in a helpless spot as this monstrous entity enters the room with his chainsaw and leaves them at a loss for words. As this comic issue comes to a horrifying end, Leatherface singles out Louise and even attacks her with his chainsaw while the rest of the girls cling to each other in utter shock. As the next issue begins, the sheriff approaches the girls and wonders who's next, and Julianne volunteers to face Leatherface. While the other girls tell her to stay with them, she reassures them, and we see that she is hiding a sharp pencil behind her back. In an act of great courage, Julianne tries to stab the sheriff's palm with the pencil, but the things backfire as he whips out his gun in retaliation. However, the girls take this moment to run away and escape, and Rosa especially has a hard time keeping her cool and processing everything. To make things worse, they stumble upon the Millsaps' disfigured dead faces, and Leatherface soon finds their hiding spot and tears away at the walls with his chainsaw. Thankfully, the girls outrun him, and Julianne and Rosa find themselves safe as they reach the sheriff's car outside the building. While they sigh in relief, they soon realize that they cannot leave Marcia, Sadie, and Ellie behind and come up with a plan to rescue them. At the same moment, they hear the sheriff walking with Ellie, but they barely have any time to act as Leatherface sneaks up on them and especially corners Rosa. While she screams for help, Leatherface finally attacks her with his chainsaw, while the sheriff continues to interrogate Marcia and Sadie. As the scene shifts back to Julianne, we see her hiding behind a tree as she watches Leatherface drag Rosa's body with him. He ends up facing an old woman who addresses him as Thomas Hewitt and warns him against bringing strange women into their home. However, he pays no attention to this and eventually takes Rosa to his lair, where he sets her body on a chair and carves a mask out of her face. Julianne sneakily observes this from a crack in the window, while the sheriff takes Marcia and Sadie outside and almost attacks Sadie with an axe. However, Mrs. Hewitt stops him by hollering at him from her window and warns him to keep it down and quit playing around as they continue to stir up a ruckus. Leatherface also makes his way outside while wearing Rosa's face as a mask, and Mrs. Hewitt finally loses her calm and orders all of them to come back inside, while Leatherface and the sheriff obey her. Marcia and Sadie catch their breath outside when Julianne finds them and takes them both to an abandoned shed. She tells them that she saw the Millsaps' dead bodies, and they all sit down and talk about their past lives. We learn that Sadie's father would try to harass her when Julianne stepped in and called the police on him, and Sadie even apologizes to Julianne for mistreating her at school, despite all that she did for her. While they have a bonding moment, the issue comes to a terrifying end as the sheriff locates their hiding place and also summons Leatherface, who promptly shows up with his signature chainsaw. In the climax issue of this comic series, the girls run towards the door and hide in a corner while Leatherface tries to track them down. Marcia especially has a hard time keeping herself calm, and she eventually gives up and leaves the room only to find herself face to face with Leatherface. While Julianne and Sadie stick by each other's side and try to escape, Leatherface attacks Marcia with his chainsaw and claims her life. On the other hand, the sheriff and Mrs. Hewitt have an intense discussion when they eventually come across Julianne and Sadie. They trap them in chairs and tie them up with ropes, and the sheriff even pulls out Julianne's letter from her pocket and has a look at its contents. Soon enough, the girls come back to their senses and find themselves facing Mrs. Hewitt's handicapped son, Monty. Monty ends up attacking Sadie and declares that he wants to claim Julianne's life as well, and that Leatherface should stay away from her. As the two of them start bickering, Mrs. Hewitt declares that she will be the judge of who gets who, and Julianne remains to be the only survivor at this point. She is soon strapped in for the Hewitt's family dinner and is horror-struck as they set up the dinner table with Mrs. Hewitt, Leatherface, Monty, and the sheriff, among others. The old lady of the house serves them all and asks the two boys to explain why they both want to claim Julianne, while Monty says that she would last longer with him and that Leatherface would just rough her up. Julianne pleads with them to let her go. She even promises to keep any and all details to herself, but they disregard her pleas and direct their attention to Leatherface as he throws up all over the young girl. In a moment of disgust, Mrs. Hewitt declares that Monty could have Julianne all to himself and even comments on how this would be his wedding night. While Julianne is tied to Monty's bed, he tries to get to know her and tells her that they will be together for a long time. However, she is quite disgusted and she hurls abuses at him while he tries to push himself onto her. Thankfully, Julianne is powerful enough to overpower a disabled Monty, and she soon pushes him off her and runs into the other room to rescue Ellie. With both Mr. and Mrs. Millsap dead, Julianne takes care of their daughter and runs out of the house with Leatherface on their tail. Julianne also gets her hand on a chainsaw, and she rushes to the road to hail for a ride when she fortunately finds some help. An elderly man agrees to drive them to safety, and the two girls get in a car with him, while Leatherface is left behind dumbfounded. Eventually, the comic comes to an end with several local news articles talking about how Julianne murdered the rest of the choir and the Millsaps. While she tries to make a case for herself, she is also taken into custody, and we soon learn that the Hewitts found her letter and replaced it with a note admitting to all the killings. They successfully managed to frame all the murders on this young girl in quite a tragic twist of events. and Julianne is left in police custody as they read out her letter where she talks about how she wanted to kill everyone around her and end things for once and all. Marvelous verdict. With that, we come to an end of all the storylines that were part of the 2003 re-release of the iconic Texas Chainsaw Massacre. From a movie that does not shy away from showing all the nitty-gritty details behind the killing, to a 3-part comic that creates a premise for the film's events. This movie-comic combo has certainly done justice to the original series, and we hope you enjoyed exploring it with us. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe. Thanks, everyone.